regarding development financing. One has to understand that development financing needs, as typical financing, funding which the banks require, which the banks need for themselves. And at the moment, you have to see that in the banking world out there are two different kind of banks at the moment, to put it really in a nutshell. The one are the banks like Helaba, like some Austrian banks, having huge deposits, which will mean they are funding on the deposit levels, more or less. And then you have the typical specialized banks out there, if they are still existing or still active, like Eurohypo, Westimo, Pfandbrief Bank, and some others, which have to rely on the German Pfandbrief. That's their main source of financing. Now you can discuss whether the German or whether the Pfandbrief market is open or whether the Pfandbriefs are bought by the European Central Bank. But anyway, it's their main source of refinancing. And it is very, very difficult to fund a development loan via the Pfandbrief. You can do it, but it's very difficult technical-wise internally. That is why a lot of banks, especially the ones relying on the Pfandbrief, are at the moment not at all willing to finance development loans, because for them it's almost impossible to get funding. And that's simply the reason. It's not that they don't like it, they don't like the risk, don't like the countries, don't like the developers. It's a pure, how should I say it, a pure need of funding which is not available. And this is still, I mean, when we go out, when we look at the numbers, you know, 500, 700 billion of euros have to be refinanced this year. 500, 700 billion. And I mean, all the CMBS transactions, which luckily do not apply for Central Eastern Europe here, because they are mainly in the western part here. But when you look at all the numbers, and when you look at all the numbers of bank bonds expiring in the course of this year, which also have to be refinanced, you see that there is a huge gap out there. I mean, that's why the European Central Bank floated the market with 900 to 1,000 billion of euros, which the banks partly deposit again at the European Central Bank. But it's not that they do not want to get them back into the normal, let's say, money circulation, money flow. It's simply the pure need. They know there will be our own bonds, which we have issues coming due over the next 12 to 18 months. And can we refinance ourselves via the markets? And as long as this question is not really, let's say, answered, they have to keep the money on their accounts because they have to repay their bondholders. That's the problem. So I think that the money at the moment deposited at the European Central Bank by the European banks is something like 500 billion euros, so almost half of it, which the European Central Bank, you know, gave into the market. But the banks, it's not that the banks like to have the money on their own and get a high deposit interest from the European Central Banks. It's the pure need. It's the uncertainty of the market, what will come in the next 12 to 18 months. And that's the reason. That's why it's very difficult for banks to fund themselves. And once again, if you have to rely on the Pfandbrief, it's almost impossible to do a development financing. That's the, let's say, the combination.